Welcome, football fans, to a Monday morning episode of the Call Sheet Daily Podcast here at the Fans First Sports Network. I'm your host, Kevin Smith. Little change in the music. I went back to my old intro music from the original Call Sheet when I was doing that podcast weekly back when I first started a couple years ago. Figured, well, we're on a new platform now. We've switched the platform on which we're recording our podcasts. Hopefully there won't be any technical difficulties here. I get through this one. This is my maiden voyage on the new platform. And I figured, hey, new platform, man, let's bring back the old music. I just thought it was a good time for that. Anyway, Monday morning, and on today's show, on our opener, really interesting conversation. The topic is this: why the public financing of sports stadiums in America is a bad idea. Because I really do believe that it is a poor use of taxpayer dollars. And that may sound surprising coming from a guy who's been a football coach for 30 some years and is a football junkie. And I do love to go to the new stadiums. They have wonderful amenities. They make it a really fun experience for the fan. But the notion that over 75% of these stadiums are being funded, or 75% of the funding for these stadiums, I should say, over the last 50 years has come from the taxpayer, is problematic. And let's get into why. First of all, why this topic today? Because today, June 30th, there was a vote due in Cincinnati on whether or not to issue a bond referendum that would spend $470 million to renovate Paycor Stadium, where the Bengals play. And it would also extend the team's lease on that stadium and thereby keep them in Cincinnati for the next 11 years. Now, that's not going to go down today because last week they reached an agreement to, in fact, do just that. $470 million reinvestment, so to speak, into Paycor Stadium. Bengals will be there for the next 11 years. But the interesting thing is this: $350 million of that $470 million price tag is going to come from taxpayers. And the interesting question is this: is that a worthwhile use of taxpayer dollars? You know, I've said before, and I'll reiterate this, I don't deem the Call Sheet Daily to be a political show. This is not really a political conversation. I'm not going to talk about Democrats, Republicans, etc. But I do think it is a worthwhile conversation to address the question of whether or not this is a wise use of taxpayer dollars. Some history, right? I'm a history teacher. I like to integrate history into the podcast. If you go way back to 1862, the owner of what was then called the Union Club grounds in Brooklyn enclosed that stadium and began to charge admissions for fans to come and watch baseball games. Baseball was a fledgling sport during the Civil War. The Union Club grounds held exhibitions by what were then professional players. They weren't being paid anything significant, but they were being paid. But the owner, William Kameyer, recognized that you couldn't pay the players without having a revenue stream yourselves. And in order to create a revenue stream, you needed to get people to pay admission. And so he enclosed the Union Club grounds, essentially built a fence around it, and began to charge for admissions. That was really the first ever stadium in America. It's better known to people as the Polo Grounds. It became known as the Polo Grounds years later. My mom used to tell stories about going to the Polo Grounds with her father to see the then New York Giants play. It's the home of one of the most iconic catches in baseball history, Willie Mays' famous over-the-shoulder catch of a long drive hit by, I can't remember who the batter was. I want to say Vic Wertz at the Polo Grounds. Center field in the Polo Grounds was 480 feet. You were not hitting a home run to dead center in the Polo Grounds. But the Polo Grounds was the first ever stadium, and the owner, William Kameyer, was onto something. And he was on to the notion of charging people to come watch these sporting events live. And in order to do that, you needed to provide an adequate venue. And venues, as we all know, have gotten more and more grandiose over time. How grandiose? Well, the Polo Grounds, which was fairly rustic, I would say, fairly remedial in terms of stadiums. They had benches rather than individual seats in much of the stadium. You just walked in and you grabbed a seat, and they sold some popcorn and they sold some concessions, but there wasn't a whole lot of, there wasn't much that I would call fancy. Well, picture what we now have today. I mean, in 2020, in Los Angeles, SoFi Stadium was built for a price tag of $6 billion. SoFi Stadium, home of the Rams and the Chargers in the NFL, home of the 2026 World Cup, home of the 2028 Summer Olympics. It is going to be a prime venue on the world stage in the coming years. And it cost $6 billion to build. Why? Because increasingly, the amenities offered at these stadiums are scaled up so that the stadiums themselves are appealing to a much higher end clientele who are willing to pay for luxuries like personalized boxes. The stadium licenseship owner, you get to own a seat, right? The personalized seat licenses, club lounges, luxury boxes, stadium suites, etc. Massive scoreboards that you can see from outer space. This is what's going into these stadiums these days, because this is the ways that owners can now get the most money from the public to come to the venue, transfer those earnings into their own pockets, of course, but also into the salaries of players, which obviously have exploded. And the real trick is, to making it work, getting taxpayers, the American public, to pay for it. It's kind of fascinating. I mentioned this right at the beginning of the show. I'll say it again. Between 1970 and 2020, the median public contribution to new stadiums constructed in the United States and Canada was 73%. So a total price tag of just over $33 billion. Other infrastructure projects often come with that, roads and utilities around those stadiums. In order to pay for those projects, the government has to put up money up front. They often do it by issuing bonds, and then to pay the dividends on those bonds, then they have to, of course, generate revenue. Well, what does that revenue come from? Where does that revenue come from? It comes from taxes. And so we get to the interesting question of, is it worth it? Are the expenditure of taxes for the construction of privately owned stadiums, does that create an economic benefit for the taxpayer and for the region in general that outweighs the tax burden? And I think overwhelmingly the answer is no, it does not. It doesn't. Because again, in order to pay for this, you got to find ways to generate new revenue streams. Well, those new revenue streams are always coming out of the pockets of the taxpayers. They come in the form of sales tax increases, of property tax increases, sometimes of increases in tolls on public roads. In Arlington, Texas, in order to pay for Jerry Jones's Jerry World Stadium, the Dallas Cowboys Stadium, they approved a 0.5-cent sales tax increase in the entire state of Texas, a 2% hotel tax in the Arlington, Dallas, Fort Worth area, a 5% car rental tax. Now that's interesting. Sales tax, hotel tax, car rental tax. Who are they hitting? Who are they hitting for that money? Well, they're hitting tourists and visitors, people who are coming to the stadium. So now you've already paid the tip for the ticket, you've paid for the parking, and now the price of those things is being exaggerated because you're paying for the stadium. studies have shown overwhelmingly that the benefits from these projects go often to the immediate area around the stadium, the neighborhood around the stadium, or the businesses around the stadium. But the tax revenue is being generated across the entire state. So it's not like a stadium in Arlington is creating a benefit for people in Corpus Christi, which is hours away. It's not like a stadium in, you do a massive renovation to Madison Square Garden in New York City and you use New York State tax dollars to pay for it. Buffalo's 7 hours from New York City. Are residents of Buffalo benefiting from that renovation to Madison Square Garden? Of course they're not. The benefits also go to the wealthy owners and into the pockets of the wealthy investors. And that really is where we're going to now get to the crux of the story. Because it's interesting. You can make this argument about all public goods. What public goods should we pay for and what should we not? And I think that there are some obvious answers as to things that overwhelmingly benefit the public. Roads and bridges and infrastructure projects overwhelmingly benefit the public because everybody uses them. Everybody benefits. There's no such thing as Republican roads or Democratic roads. There's just roads. Everybody benefits. I would make the argument that everybody benefits from the public good that is education. And some people would say, well, hey, man, I don't like my taxpayer dollars funding public schools. But they don't just have to fund public schools. There's all sorts of different schools that they can fund, whether they're charter schools or magnet schools, right? Or academies, etc. But the investment in education pays itself back to the public in obvious ways. I would argue that the military is a worthwhile public good. If you want to quibble over the overall price tag, do we need a $1 trillion military? Well, that's an argument worth having. But the security of the country is absolutely worth people pitching in to guarantee. But is it worth it for people to pony up extra money so that a wealthy owner can further line his pockets by building a massive brand new stadium when there's nothing really wrong with the old stadium? We're now into the keeping up with the Joneses phase of stadium construction. And I kind of mean that literally, if you take Jerry Jones as a great example of somebody who built a ridiculous stadium, an over-the-top stadium that's kind of like an homage to himself. And now future stadiums will all be judged against how do they weigh up or how do they rate compared to Jerry World. I mean, look at what the proposed upgrades to Paycor Stadium that were in that bill that was supposed to be voted on by today. They were supposed to reach a resolution by today. And again, they reached that resolution late last week. $470 million, $350 million of which is going to come out of the pockets of taxpayers. And it's going to be the primary money is going to go to luxury boxes, club lounges, stadium suites, and new scoreboards. Luxury boxes, club lounges, stadium suites, and new scoreboards. Who is that going to benefit? That is going to benefit the wealthiest of those individuals attending games. Could you argue that, well, there'll be new jobs created from that? Well, sure, in the short term. In the short term, there will. But the funding for this will stretch decades, meaning the tax hit. And those jobs will be long gone by the time those tax dollars are still being used to pay for that stadium. Why do politicians propose these referendums and these massive funding projects? Because they are political winners. I started the show by talking about SoFi Stadium in LA, home of the Rams. Where were the Rams before they were at SoFi? They were in St. Louis, playing in the Edward Jones Dome. And they left St. Louis in 2015 because the voters of St. Louis would not consent to the construction of, it actually wasn't a new stadium. They wanted $700 million in renovations to the Edward Jones Dome. There was a line in the lease that the Rams had with the city that said if the Edward Jones Dome did not rank among the top 25% of stadiums in the country in terms of its amenities and its services, essentially it had to be one of the nicest 25% of stadiums in the country based upon a set of criteria. If it didn't meet it, then either the city was on the hook to provide the money to upgrade it to bring it in line, bring it into that top 25, or the Rams could get out of the lease. And the city chose not to fund that project. They voted no on the $700 million, and Georgia Frontiere picked up and left, moved to LA. And politicians are terrified of that. They are terrified of the threat of relocation because what is the number one thing that a politician is concerned with? They are concerned with being reelected. Particularly members of Congress. If you are the local representative, you have no term limits. There are no term limits in our Congress. You can run for as many terms as you can get elected to. If you are the representative or the senator of a professional sports franchise that is incredibly popular and it leaves, it goes and moves to another state because you couldn't get a deal done to keep it there, that could be the end of your political career. So that's why they are politically these stadiums are often put to referendum because the politicians recognize that it is their careers on the line. Politics not meant to be a career, by the way. What are the alternatives? If these stadiums are not being publicly funded, well, what are the alternatives? I mean, one thing you could have is that you could have federal legislation prohibiting these subsidies, these referendums. Because again, the evidence shows they fail to generate enough tax revenue, enough new jobs, the construction of enough businesses to justify the price tag. They're not worth it. They're bad policy. And again, this is coming from somebody who is 100% a football guy. I don't want to see teams leave, but do taxpayers need to be on the hook for things that are going to, again, line the pockets of wealthy owners, inflate salaries even further? Look what's going on with the salary cap in professional football. It is skyrocketing. A generic deal for a franchise quarterback these days is now over $50 million a year. I do believe that if you lessen the tax hit, that if you put corporations on the hook a little bit more for the renovations to the stadiums that bear their names. Why do you have naming rights? We have naming rights where the corporation forks over X million numbers of dollars to have their name on the stadium. Shouldn't they also be on the hook for some of the renovations when it's time? Billionaire owners, shouldn't they have to pay out of pocket a little bit when it's time? If some taxpayer dollars are being used, I'm okay with it. Because it does benefit the immediate area. There is civic pride in your team. The Eagles just won the Super Bowl. Philly is beaming with Eagles pride. Should you have to pay for a little of that? Sure, I don't have a problem with that. A little of that. 75%? 75%. That's the going rate these days. And it's not just these days. It's 50 years. It's been going on for a long time. If you want to build a new stadium or do a massive renovation, you're on the hook for 75% of the cost. There is no other private industry like that in America where the public is overwhelmingly on the hook for the cost of a thing, but the benefit of the thing goes into the pockets of a very, very few people. And I think that's problematic. So I would love to see some kind of legislation. Maybe it's not ban the public funding altogether, but maybe it's cap the amount that the public is on the hook for. Because we're now building $6 billion stadiums. Do we need $6 billion stadiums? And does the public need to be paying for most of that? I say no. All right, that is our Monday morning opener. Join me again tomorrow and all week long here as we break out our new platform here on Riverside, where the video quality is excellent. So, we want to go over onto YouTube or check out the clips that we're going to cut up and put on Twitter. I think the video quality is great, and we're happy to be into this new venture. So, for Kevin Smith, right, this has been the Call Sheet Daily. Join me again tomorrow, and have a great day, everybody. Take care.